Oh, apologies. Kind of got lost in my head there for a second. So Brooklyn asked, is Brooklyn here?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Excellent. So Zane is with you?
Yes, this is my husband, Zane.
Hey, Zane. Thank you for joining us, bud. Okay, I don't know why it would be a problem. So thank you for asking. It's very respectful of you. I don't know why it would be a problem, so I'm glad he's here.
Okay.
Okay. So let's talk about fucking. So hopefully you all can see my screen. So where we left off last, actually, wait a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. What questions do you all have before we start talking about course content? If they come up, would you be so kind as to do what Brooklyn did? For those of you that have the little chat feature on your app, the conversation feature, it's a little text bubble. Go ahead and write in that, and then Linda will holler out when you've done that, because I won't necessarily see the chat windows pop up. And so they'll let me know when you've asked a question, and I'll be glad to pause and we can talk. So if you have a point or if you have a question, feel free to put it there, and then they'll call my attention to it, okay? Because some people I know are, I'm learning, are a little bit nervous about speaking out loud or speaking in this format, so this option might help. Okay, so we were talking about the contributors to the psychiatric and psychological qualifiers for mental illness, for abnormal psychology. And we talked about suffering and how our culture defines suffering in certain ways and actually doesn't really have a way of accepting or validating suffering. So therefore suffering is abnormal. Maladaptiveness is when normally adaptive behavior goes bad. And last time we talked about eating, sleeping, socializing, fighting, and fleeing. Well, today we begin with having sex. One of the things that's really shocking to me is this blind eye that many people take around sexual experience and sexual behavior, and that is that it's very adaptive and extremely healthy, and can be, just like eating can be, sleeping can be, socializing, fighting, and fleeing. All of those can be. With sex, it's okay. To give you an idea, oftentimes I've had clients and parents, etc., religious leaders in my office wringing their hands and trying to figure out why people watch pornography and masturbate. And they never consider the most obvious answer that is also the truest answer, because it feels good. Like, they forget that. They think that somebody who watches pornography and masturbates must be psychologically messed up in some way to do that. No, they're not. It feels good. That's why people do things, right? We eat because food tastes good. We sleep because we get tired and sleeping feels good. We socialize because we get lonely and socializing feels good. Like, frustrates me that they miss the obvious answer as to why people do it. Now, a better question, and this is actually a more rare question, is why do some people compromise their health, physical, mental, psychological health, right, emotional health, or the health of other people through their behavior, right? And that's a different question, because although it feels good, it is felt good to the point of now it's maladaptive. So one of the things we get to wonder about is when this good behavior, sexual behavior, has gone bad. Like masturbation, for example, is a healthy thing. When we look at for people who refuse to do it and don't do it, we can actually measure their health problems. For example, the people who, let's start with men who ejaculate 3 times a week or more have a measurably lower incidence of both prostate problems and prostate cancer, as well as testicular problems and testicular cancer. Years ago, for example, I came home and handed my wife those articles and said, hey, baby, how would you like to help me prevent cancer? well, she was raised in a rather uh, unhealthy, sexually shaming kind of culture, so it didn't go over well with her at the time. The point being is it's healthy, right? People who embrace themselves sexually are healthier longer than people who don't. However, right, we also get to look at the other side of it, and that is, what about people who are compulsively having sex all the time, who are constantly swiping on Grindr and Tinder, etc., just trying to get the next faceless, nameless hookup? Well, their health is compromised, and their health of other people is compromised. So one of the things I really enjoy, because dealing with this pays me a lot of money as a therapist, is that people think that you either have to dismiss this and say it's all bad, like be very sexually shaming and overly sexually controlled, or people will go totally off the rails and be very, very sexually unhealthy. The reason I laugh about this is because when we look at people who are very, very sexually unhealthy, they disproportionately come from a religious or cultural practice where sexual behavior is very unhealthy. And so that black and white thinking bounces people between extremes, between barely controlled celibacy and chastity of a very strange sort, to out of control, impulsive and compulsive sexual behavior. There are far more healthy ways to do this, just like there are healthier ways to eat, sleep, socialize, fight, flee, etc. And so the DSM, because there have been understandable and important movements in the direction of sexual health and sexual freedom, the writers of the DSM have been more reluctant to talk about or develop diagnoses around sexual impulsivity and compulsivity of particular sorts. But good sexual behavior can go bad. One of the things that's really fun is the way in which different cultural groups talk about when it goes bad differently, and how sometimes they're onto something, and oftentimes they are, but never to the degree that they're certain that they are. So when I moved to Utah and opened up my private practice some 12 years ago, and as somebody who researches a lot the intersections of religiosity and mental health, I found myself with a practice full of men who masturbate. And after just a few months, I came into class, again, although I've been teaching for many, many years, I was new to UVU, and I came to class, and this is my counseling and psychotherapy class. And I told my students, I said, if you guys want to make $1 million fast, open up an intensive outpatient treatment clinic for pornography use here in Utah County. You'll make bank. And since then, two of my students have two different clinics. One, they're now millionaires. The other one crashed and burned because therapists thought they could run the business. The business side and the therapy side don't get along well. You need a business person and a therapy person to make it work, and they need to cooperate. But it was really, yeah.
He asked if porn addiction would be considered maladaptive then.
Okay. And we found a lot of relational problems and neurological problems associated with it. Thank you, Kate. The answer is yes. We need to be very specific, though, about what we mean by porn addiction. Okay, for example, a mom brought her 15-year-old boy into me, dragged him into my office and sat him down. She made the appointment for him. And she goes, my son's addicted to porn. And I go, well, he is? Okay. What do you mean? And she hands me her phone, and it's a picture of a girl in a bikini. And she goes, I took this screenshot because this is what I caught him looking at. Okay, you guys, and I said, what? And so then the therapy with the boy was how to deal with his perfectionistic and toxic mother, and nothing to do with pornography, right? So when we look at the neurological problems associated with pornography use, then we do see relational problems and neurological problems because of it. What's interesting, though, and something the researchers who are anti-porn are slow to point out, is it varies across culture. For example, there is a friend of mine, we call him Garvey. He lives back in Indiana. He is a high-end connoisseur and critic of pornography. We're not talking the maid in a garage somewhere in LA, genital slapping, ow, give me baby kind of porn. We're talking the high production value, actors and sets and makeup, and he is a connoisseur and a critic of that and makes his money doing that. He has terabytes upon terabytes of high-def porn, and he does masturbate at least daily. If we were to measure his relational and neurological problems, they would be precisely 0. If I were to go to, say, a 17-year-old boy who would like to go on an LDS mission, and he masturbates every other day, he's going to have far worse relational and neurological problems because of all the stress and guilt associated with his activity. And so that's why I'm a little frustrated. Like, there's an organization called Fight the New Drug, and it's an anti-porn organization. And they came to me because, as you guys know, I've researched and published a fair bit in this area. And they said, oh, you would be a great faculty advisor for this. And they came in, they met with me, lovely, earnest young people, and they finished their spiel. And I said, not only no, but hell no, I'm not going to be your advisor. I don't want to have anything to do with your organization. And they said, why? And I said, because shame fuels compulsive behavior, whether it's heroin addiction, porn addiction, etc. And you guys are running around shaming people. You're the last people I want to associate with in this way. What really helps is acceptance. Obvious answers like, well, this feels good. What's going on in your life that you're doing this much? We find that part of what pollutes the research is some people who compulsively use pornography, like 3-4 hours a day masturbating to the point they've got calluses where Mother Nature didn't intend us to have calluses, is because they feel so crappy in the rest of their lives. They were usually pretty depressed and pretty anxious, and they're turning to porn to deal with it. So they already had neurological problems. So one of the things that I worry when I read the Fight the New Drug research is they didn't do a pre-post study. They didn't take a bunch of people who are healthy and then put them on porn 3 hours a day, make them masturbate, and then measure them post, right? Instead, they go, oh, there are these neurological problems. Well, yeah, but for many people, and it seems like most, they had a lot of struggles, a lot of life difficulties before this became a problem. So yeah, Fight the New Drug. I appreciate there's virtue in what they're trying to do. I just wish they would go about it differently and use better research. Because one of the things they're not doing is really talking to and owning and valuing the stories of those people who have suffered these kinds of processes. Right? So thank you for letting me go on that tangent, but it relates. What's adaptive in one culture is maladaptive in another. Okay? And we're not very good at talking about that because we want what is true for, say, Chelsea Oldroy to be true for Megan Wendell. You know what I mean? Like, we want these universal things, and that's just not the way life necessarily is. There are similarities we can point out, and those are valuable, and there are differences we can point out, and those are valuable as well. So it looks like there's some attendance stuff getting cleared up there. I hope I didn't miss other people's comments. Okay, so one of the things that worries me is that the maladaptiveness is looked at in an individual way, from an assumption of individuals. That as a field, psychiatry and psychology are much slower to look at what's maladaptive for society. For example, some behaviors, as I say here, are societally accepted, but seriously societally maladaptive. And so what we mean by adaptive is in the sense of what helps everybody live, thrive, and survive. There's a graphic. Let's see if I can share with you guys. Whoops. Okay, can you guys see this? See a picture of the rich got richer during the pandemic? Can anybody see that screen? Oh, you can? Thank you. Okay, now, I don't have a beef with wealthy people, right? I'm not a Marxist. I may be sympathetic to some people's concerns about capitalism, etc., and I think those concerns are valid. Now, there is nothing in this image that would trouble me around adaptiveness, right? Some people are wealthy, that's fine. What intrigues me, though, is that this exists in a context of all of the people who are now very, very poor because of the pandemic, okay? And that's where we get to wonder, is the way we treat wealth as a global economy and a global society adaptive to all of us, or is it hyper-adaptive to a select few individuals? So there are things like, you know, these political and economic practices that allow people to get phenomenally more wealthy when many people are growing more impoverished. And we get to say, okay, is this societally adaptive? There's nothing in the DSM. You know, I just realized they're all male. The other thing I just realized, they're almost all white. Okay, therefore, you know, like we get to have other concerns, right? Is this good for women? Right? If you take money as a good, and most people do, I personally don't, but if we take money as a good, then we can wonder about how adaptive this is for women. We can wonder about how adaptive this is for non-whites, right? We can wonder about all of these things. We can wonder if this distribution of wealth here is adaptive for the millions of people who lost their jobs during COVID, right? And so there's no diagnosis for this. Psychology, psychiatry doesn't care. And so one of the things that really frustrates me personally is that those of us who do clinical work, and that maybe some of you someday, if you're not already, is we get to feel greatly concerned because the way wealth is distributed also predicts who lives longer and who is healthier. It is maladaptive to be poor. And one of the things that I love that our screwed up society does is we blame the poor for being poor. In fact, a friend of mine, he lives 2 doors down. He works 2 jobs. He's a mechanic. He's got highly technical, skilled training on a particular form of diesel mechanics, and he does that during the day. And then at night, he works as a technician in a repairman, technician, engineer in a essential oils factory. He's working 2 jobs. I've never seen a man work harder to support his wife and children. And they struggle financially all the time because he has 2 children with congenital birth defects, congenital health conditions that they weren't made aware of until their children were 8 and 6 respectively. And so here he is desperately struggling to survive. All the money he makes goes into just providing for his family. There's no money left over for Christmas. There's no money left over for vacations. There's nothing. And yet it was really fun because we were talking over the fence, and another colleague of mine who's quite well-to-do came over for a barbecue, and he starts lecturing this guy who works 2 jobs that all he needs to do is work harder, and the American dream is real. Okay, so people who are poor are more likely to suffer from mental health problems. They're more likely to suffer from physical health problems. They don't live as long, right? As the gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow in this country, we see that American life expectancy is going down. Chances are you will not live as long as your grandparents did, unless you're very wealthy. I love this. Nobody's talking about it. And so there's no diagnosis for it. What's fun though is we do have diagnoses for some behaviors. Like there's a diagnosis called antisocial personality disorder. When I worked in prisons, I met many men who were diagnosable with antisocial personality disorder. This is a personality disorder associated with not believing that A, the rules apply to you, and B, if the rules do, you just break them anyway, right? So some of these men, not many, but some of them made a lot of money by breaking the rules around fraud or drug dealing or gun control or things like that. In fact, some of them would sit down and talk to me about every new law that is passed is a new opportunity for profit. Okay? So the maladaptiveness, I just want to throw that idea out there that isn't it interesting that we as therapists work with people who are desperate, they're anxious, they're depressed, they're lost because the way the economy has been destroyed. And yet we diagnose the individual and not the cultural or economic situation. It says a lot about our values as a society. Okay, so moving on. Deviancy is another category of abnormality that my colleagues in psychiatry and psychology pay attention to. So deviancy actually indicates that which deviates from the norm. So if we were to take the normal curve again, and we take that on any given topic, this particular normal curve you see on your screen here, that particular normal curve then means that the people who are here in this dark blue section, the 68.2%, they're not deviant, but everybody in the paler blue sections out to the tails are increasingly deviant. So when it comes to musical talent, for example, when it comes to singing, I'm about here. I can't sing on key to save my life. Okay. When it comes to playing the bass guitar, I'm a middling bassist. I'm not the best. I'm not very good, but I'm okay. Right. And so I'm perfectly normal when it comes to playing bass, right? A little on the low side of average. Way, way, way below average on my ability to sing. So therefore, I'm deviant because I can't sing. But if you notice, there's two tails. Therefore, those of you with perfect pitch or who can sing or perform an instrument beautifully are deviant, right? You're no longer part of the norm. What I think is fun is that when you talk to psychiatrists and psychologists about deviancy, they don't mean people with perfect pitch who are abnormally generous, abnormally gracious, abnormally altruistic, or abnormally kind. No, they leave the good things out. And when they talk about deviance, they only talk about it in terms of this other side of the normal curve. So I like teasing them about that. Okay. So what they basically define deviance is that which is outside the normal middle that we don't like. Okay, if we don't like it, then that's deviant. Okay, I think it's funny. So characteristics like sociopathy and psychopathy. So for those of you that have taken the forensic psychology class, this is a review. Psychopathy is its lack of empathy for others, tendency to use and encounter others as objects to be manipulated and controlled for the gratification of one's own wants, needs, or desires, right? Psychopaths don't relate with compassion or empathy with other people. They relate to other people manipulatively. And so then sociopaths, in one tradition, because by the way, neither of these terms are very well defined in the literature, and what the British mean by these terms is different than what the Americans do. But one of the definitions of sociopathy I like, and that is a psychopath who's also predatory, meaning that they're actively fraudulent because they can, or they're rapists or serial killers or things like that, that they are predatory psychopaths or sociopaths. So that's, again, you can find other definitions out there as well. I just happen to like that one. So criminality, abusiveness, rudeness, violating other people's social discomfort zones. Because American society is sexually weird, you know, and we're pretty uptight in some ways and very libertine in other ways, that when you talk to a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, I've got a client with some deviancy, they immediately go to sexual deviancies. It's quite fun. Just watch them do it. Even though that's not necessarily the problem. Okay, sorry, I'm just catching up on y'all's questions. So, Kate, so just like anything, alcohol, etc., porn becomes a problem when used as an unhealthy coping strategy. On an individual level, yes. It's actually psychologically and morally a more complicated question when we look at it in relation, okay? So we'll have a unit on addiction, and we'll have one day we spend on porn. So this is a teaser for that particular day. There was a study done at all places of Brigham Young University. And it wasn't until the study was well underway that the powers that be at BYU found out about it and tried to shut it down. But the study was underway. So a doctoral student in psychology broke men into several groups, and she found men who rarely used porn, or told her they rarely used porn, and broke them into various groups. She assigned them 3 hours a week to either sit and study in silence or to watch romantic comedies featuring the stylings of, say, Hugh Grant and Sandra Bullock, or to watch porn. You know, good old-fashioned log on to Pornhub, whatever's the popular video of the week, okay? And she assigned these men in these three conditions. And then what she did is over the course of 3 months, she followed and measured their levels of shame, their levels of guilt, their personality, especially psychopathy, because there's a belief in the culture that porn makes you a psychopath. She measured their depression and anxiety. And what she found is over the course of her study, nothing changed between the men who were pre and post, between the men who were in the study alone group, the rom-com group, and the porn group, except one very, very interesting variable. Men who utilized pornography weekly, well, 3 hours a week, found their flesh and blood spouse, all these young men were married, they found their flesh and blood wives increasingly less attractive over time. That the more they used porn, it was retuning their libidos to be digitized, to be pixelated, to be fetishized, right? That they were attuning their libidos to their screens and to their hands, not to their wives. And so they were less and less sexually satisfied with their wives. And so that's a very interesting thing, because that helps us realize that many things that we use, alcohol, heroin, porn, caffeine, dating, whatever we use to help ourselves feel better, can come at the expense of other people. So one of the things we get to wonder about is what makes it unhealthy. Like a young man who is single, masturbating, looking at playboy.com, masturbating occasionally, that's actually more healthy than it isn't if he's not freaking and stressed out with shame and guilt. Now, if he's doing it regularly, then the research that one of our colleagues posted about there could be neurological consequences to that might be pretty unhealthy. But the other thing is, we're not very good at looking at the relationships that happen within the world of porn itself. Is it okay for us as a society to have jobs where people are sexually objectified? And what happens to the people in the porn industry once porn is no longer being filmed, or once they're no longer a part of that? And the answer is the health consequences for them are on average not very good. They're not horrible, although some horrible things have and do happen, nor are they necessarily brilliant, although that has happened, they're more rare. Instead, on average, it's not a healthy line of work. And so some of you have seen documentaries like When Porn Ends. Sure, it'll end. Does that help? So I don't know if you can see me again or not. I don't know how this looks on your end.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. And so there are documentaries that actually go through, and some are very much vilifying of the porn industry, and you can kind of tell up front as you start watching these documentaries that it's a hack and slash job. But some are very earnest, where they're very curious what happens to people who were once widely featured in pornographic films, what happens to them afterwards, right? And so when we begin to track that down, what we find is that on average, their health outcomes and their relationship outcomes aren't ideal. So therefore, yes, masturbation and pornography use can be relatively healthy if done in moderation. But then we have a deeper moral problem, and that is it okay if it's exploitative of the people in the industry, right? That's a societal and cultural problem we need to ask ourselves. So it's fascinating that we're hoarding money, but if people hoard cars, clothes, food, right, it's weird. I'm totally down with that, Kate. I feel that. So, oh, by the way, the other thing that I would like to point out while we're talking about the local cultural fascination with pornography, and again, it was really fun moving to Utah where suddenly porn exists. Yes, it exists elsewhere, but there are no porn treatment clinics. Nobody's going to their priest or rabbi because of porn. That's a Utah, Mississippi thing disproportionately. But we privilege one type of porn, like Pornhub, right? That's a website that features pornographic videos. And what we don't look at are other forms of pornography, like 50 Shades of Grey. In fact, it was really fun for me some years ago. It's a novel that is writing about kinky sex life, and they write kink very badly, by the way. There have been many emergency room visits for people who try to emulate what's written about in 50 Shades of Grey, because Christian, whatever his name is, actually doesn't know anything about kink and miswrote it in dangerous ways. But it was really fun because one day, for example, I was at church, and the woman sitting next to me had her quad, which is the Latter-day Saint scripture, along with 50 Shades of Grey. And so this is a woman I know. She lives through the block from me. We're buddies. And I said, I love that you brought porn to church. I think that's very progressive. And she goes, I didn't bring porn to church. Look at my phone. She hands me my phone. There's no porn on my phone. I said, look at that book. See, we've privileged one particular type of pornography to others, right? 50 Shades of Grey is very explicit. And I love that she could bring it to church because she thinks porn is what happens on video or on picture, not in her books. So, in fact, what's fun is when we look at literature pornography, women are disproportionately likely to engage in that compared to visual pornography, is we see the same curve of dissatisfaction with their flesh and blood partner. If I see a woman and she's reading lots of romance novels, I know her husband's in a lot of trouble if she's in a marriage, right? And so men can't live up to the ideal that is presented in those novels, just like women can't live up to the ideal that's presented in movies. And it also warps our sense of the ideal. Now, to be fair to women, though, women who read romance novels, especially more explicit ones, are actually more likely to seek out their spouses sexually than men who masturbate to porn, right? Men and women have different refractory periods. And so it's the man is actually more satisfied sexually, but the relationship quality goes down because he often feels like he's getting emotionally beat up because he can't live up to the ideal in the romance novels. It's really fun. And so we get to wonder, okay, is my reading a romance novel and grabbing my vibrator on occasion healthy? Well, of course it is. But if I'm using that as a standard that I hold up to my husband and I'm mad that he is somehow really thick beard with luscious long hair, but not a hair anywhere else in his body, and is so in tune with my emotions, he can make me orgasm by walking into the room. Like, okay, that's unrealistic, and now you've created a lot of stress in your relationship. Okay, so the dynamic around what's adaptive is very complex, and I just happen to have researched a lot on the sexual end of the complexity, more so than fighting, fleeing, etc. Okay. So violation of the standards of society is another one. Laws, abstract social understanding, assume moral codes, like the sex offender registry. Like, these people have violated the standards of society so much we need to label them and have a website where we can search right where they are so we can know to stay away from them because they're deviant and they've violated the standards of society. So not only are they deviant, but they're doing so in a way that the society doesn't control well. That their modes of dress are weird, their speech is weird, their religious beliefs are weird. And so one of the things that was very interesting is looking at religious dynamics elsewhere. Like, when we lived in Indiana, I'm not exactly a religious person, but I have a pulse and I'm nice. And so the local religious leaders asked me to be what's called a young men's president, which is the person who plans activities and teaches boys from the ages of 13 to 18. And so did that for years. And what was really fun in Indiana, the LDS kids all knew each other. There were like 12 of them in this huge high school in the town we lived in, and they stuck together like glue because they were violating the standards of the society of that high school. They were clean cut, they didn't swear, they didn't do drugs, they didn't sleep around, and that made them really weird. And so they kind of banded together for survival. And in fact, one of those kids from back in the day is now one of my roommates. You know what I mean? Years later, he ended up moving to Utah. We reconnected at UVU. He needed a place to live. And so it's really neat to see how it is that the violation of standards of society is pathologizing. These kids were from bullied to barely tolerated, but they weren't popular or well accepted. In fact, one of the things that some of these kids I used to teach, as they've immigrated to Utah years later, have said is it's really interesting. In Indiana, all of us were LDS, but we come to Utah and now nobody is. When everybody is one thing, nobody is that thing. You know what I mean? And so it was really surreal for them, a little bit jarring, some of them, not all. So one of the things we get to look at is what happens when we label somebody as violating the standards of society. Like, on the one hand, that can be a sign of a really big problem. Somebody who is predatory on other people, harming other people, actively or passively destructive to human beings, human relationships, communities, etc. Like, that seems to be very important for us to have a way to relate to and talk about people who engage in these behaviors. Like I mentioned antisocial personality disorder a minute ago, that there's a reason why in psychology and psychiatry we talk about that, because people who are antisocial are against society. They're not, the word antisocial, if my math professor friend were to say it, he means somebody who is shy, right? In psychology, it means against society. It means you're antisocial. Wherever you go, society falls apart because you're breaking the rules all the time. You're anti-society, you're antisocial. So that seems to be important. One of the things, though, that I give with the religious example is how arbitrary it is, because the standards of society change depending on where you live and which cultures you're in. So, like the sex offender registry, I have a cousin who is on the sex offender registry. And I chuckle because if he'd lived anywhere other than American Fork, Utah, he'd never be on the sex offender registry. When he was 18, he's He's tall, of course. He's a draper, so he's my height. But unlike me, he's got fair skin, bright blue eyes, blonde hair, and he was raised on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. So he's kind of got an "aw shucks, sure glad to be here, miss" kind of accent. He's not stupid, but he's very shy. He's very naive. He's a sweetheart of a guy. I love him to death. And when he was 18, he went against his own preference. He went to a church dance. And while he was there, a young lady took a shine on him. And again, this guy is really shy. He always has been, still is. And she just thought, he's tall. He spends a lot of time in the sun, looks like a cowboy. She's into cowboys. And she starts dancing with him there at the church dance and says, "Hey, I'm overheating. Let's go across the street to my house." And she just lived across the street from the church, a beautiful big home. And so they walk across the street and he sits down on the couch. She gives him a glass of water and says, "I'll be right back." Well, he was led to believe that it was a 16 and up dance. Well, she comes out, and this is where the age becomes an issue. She's topless. She's just wearing her little pair of shorts, and she's topless, and smooths up on him right as her father walks in, her stake president father. And so dad melts down, violently assaults my cousin. Daughter flees screaming. Turns out she was 15. The age of consent in Utah is 16. My cousin was convicted of statutory rape. He's now on the sex offender registry, even though he's almost 40 now, all these years later, right? Everybody reports the same story. As he was arrested, as he pled out, etc. You can even look at the court records. Everybody's story is exactly the same. But if this had happened in Chicago, it would have been laughable. But here in Utah, now he's on the sex offender registry. So we get to wonder about whether or not the standards of our society are worth violating. MLK, Martin Luther King, Monday we have no class. Why? Because we celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He violated the standards of those society, and we're now grateful that he did, but the average American, white American back then wasn't grateful, right? In fact, psychology, psychiatry as a field has been very much upholding whatever the current societal values are, where we have been paid to and are implicit in pathologizing those who are violating the standards of society. Imagine the Watts riots. So some of you don't know what that is. It's when the gay people in New York finally rebelled against the constant moral persecution of the police, and the gay men rioted against the police, right? Psychology, psychiatry was there to pathologize those gay men. Now, it's unthinkable that the field of psychology or psychiatry would, now that homosexuality is widely accepted. But something I would like to infect you guys with is to be the ones, not to be antisocial and just to rebel against society because it's society, but instead to be some of the ones that wonder about, are our standards okay? And what makes our standards valid, especially when it comes to pathologizing other people. So those that change the world are considered deviant until their perspective becomes normal. So social discomfort relates to deviancy, it relates to violation of norms. And so those who, and by the way, this one's double-edged, and I realize in looking at this, I didn't write one of the edges. The first edge I'd like to talk about, that ironically enough I didn't write down here, is, are you uncomfortable in society, right? There's social discomfort you cause for other people that I have a bunch of points here about. But what I forgot to mention is, what about those people who are super uncomfortable in society? We're very quick to label both groups of people. For example, there are those who only need one close relationship. They don't really like being around people. They really don't care about, they could spend the rest of their lives alone, perfectly happy. And these people have a disorder we call schizoid personality disorder, where they're just asocial. They're not antisocial. They're not tearing down businesses and defrauding people and murdering and everything else. Instead, they're asocial. They're just without society. They are indifferent to human relationships, right? And so these people, when you put them in a crowd, are often very uncomfortable. And even just sitting there talking to them, they grow exhausted with human company very quickly, and they leave, or would like to. Like my wife has an uncle who very schizoid. He chose the profession of sheep herder just so he could get way, way away out in the middle of nowhere and away from other human beings. He would stop by his mother's house for Christmas until she died, And he found that very meaningful. He very much loves his mom, but would talk to her about a half hour once a year. And that was the sum total of his human contact, right? So there's the social discomfort in terms of the social discomfort that we experience in society. But then there's what I write about here is those of us who cause social discomfort. So something that we get to wonder about is, in this society, for example, how close do we sit or stand to each other? And some of you who may be from other countries, who have visited other countries, it varies by culture. Oh, do you need some attention? Is that what's going on here? You are as subtle as I am. No wonder we get along so well. So this is Ninja, guys. You've met him before. Yeah, smiling dog. Smiling happy dog. So how close do we sit or stand to each other? How long should you know somebody before you tell them about how you lost your virginity? So if there's an assumption that if you make the majority of people, those people in that average 68.2%, right, if you make those people uncomfortable, then you must be abnormal. But again, this seems to be very socially contextualized. That in our society, I've noticed, for example, now don't get me wrong, I'm living in Springville right now, and I have for 10 years. And I've lived in 42 different places, and this is by far my favorite. Like, I've been here 10 years. That's shockingly an abnormal long period of time for me. And it's neat because a majority of my neighbors were very slow to warm up. Don't get me wrong, when we moved in, there were loaves of bread. They helped me carry the piano upstairs. But it took years to get past friendly to friend, right? That's different than other cultures where I've lived, where people start friendly and friend, and other places I've lived, they're not friendly or friend. Like, there's no, if you're not one of our people, like we lived in rural Indiana, as I mentioned, for a while, and our neighbors, if you weren't part of the clan, they didn't care. You could die in a fire. They might call 911 if you're lucky, but there was no friendly and there was no friend in that particular county. So it's neat how it is that these vary. And so I've created social discomfort unintentionally in different ways in different places that I've lived because of local cultural norms and standards. And that's here in the United States, let alone the havoc I've caused in other countries. So number 6 is irrationality and unpredictability. Okay? So in some ways, this is humorous. The stock in trade of comics, whether comic movies, comic videos, comic stand-up comics, is unpredictability and a little flavor of madness, a little flavor of irrationality. That comedy is a great way for us to look at reality slightly differently than the norm. And so that's what makes it funny. In fact, some comics are very good at telling jokes where we don't get the punchline until they say it. And when they say it, it's hilarious because it was unpredictable. So irrationality and unpredictability is humorous. There was some years ago, I was learning how to use these things, these devil boxes. I think they're called cell phones. And I found a meme online. Clicked out of that. And I found a meme online, or a little video, and it was of a chihuahua. It was chasing a big white beach ball across a backyard. And it jumps on the beach ball to catch it, but the beach ball was really bouncy, and when the chihuahua hits it, it goes, "Betwing!" and just flies off screen. Hilarious. I just bust up laughing and sent it to my daughter. She thought it was hilarious too. Apparently we share a sense of humor even when she was little. And so it was that unpredictability. You wouldn't guess that this little tiny dog would be jettisoned off screen by a great big ball. And so that's what made it funny, is it's unpredictable. Now, oftentimes though, when we encounter unpredictability in other people, and they're right in our face, it feels dangerous, where we don't know what they're going to do next. It really erodes, if not shatters, our sense of security, safety, and comfort. So last night, for example, in the clinic, I was in the middle of a deep conversation. I enjoy doing what's called co-therapy, where the therapy trainee, like the master's students, comes into my therapy session and both of us get to work with the client together. I insist that the trainee participate rather than just sit there silently taking notes like they used to do back in the day, the professors did back in the day. Instead, they're very much in the room, and all three of us get to sit and chat together, me, the trainee, and the client. and I kept hearing a ruckus outside. A man was speaking in a very, very loud tone of voice that was very aggressive. Well, as clinical director, guess who gets to deal with that? Oh yeah, this guy. And so therefore I was girding up to stand up and walk out the door and go, okay, what's going on? Is everybody okay? When I heard the man who was yelling got close to the door, and he's like, okay, love you, bro. I really appreciate that. And then I hear the back door open and close, not loudly or aggressively, just normal open and close. And I'm like, okay. So I sat back down again, finished the conversation with that particular client, that trainee, and then I got up and checked it with one of the other therapists. Well, that therapist was still shaken because he confronted the client on a couple of issues, and the client became very aggressive, standing up, leaning over him, yelling at him, etc. And my colleague kept his cool and kept just reflecting and validating back to the man who was very aggressive. And the man who was very aggressive kept the same very loud tone, but became very apologetic, equally as apologetic loudly as he had aggressively. And so it felt very, very uncomfortable for all of us, particularly my colleague who got yelled at so much. And so he's like, I didn't know if he was going to take a swing on me. I didn't know what was going to come next. I just did my best to remain calm and just really validate him and reflect back to him. And then he was apologetic, and now he's worried that I'm going to fire him as a client. And so we talked about, process through the feelings of my peer, but it felt dangerous. In fact, back to the issue of assumptions and beliefs. You and I may know that homelessness is ultimately caused by trauma. So trauma causes mental illness, and mental illness can predict homelessness, and often does. And so we may know that. We may feel a great deal of compassion and understanding for that. But when I'm walking down Center Street in Provo, and a disheveled young man comes right up to me, right up inside my personal bubble, and starts telling me about all these things he's experiencing out of the blue, don't know the man, and then hits me up for $20. It's disconcerting. I don't know what's going to come next. Like, he was telling me about this thing with his dog and the police, and now he needs $20. What's going on? What are we talking about? And so many people find it easier to just turn a blind eye and to avoid. It's not because there's dislike or active judgment. Instead, it's a little bit of fear. I don't know what's going on here, and because I don't know what's going on, I don't feel safe. So why do we have a DSM? Why do we call people this or that diagnosis? And it's really about nomenclature. Gives psychiatry, clinical psychology therapists a common language, and around that common language establishes what might need treatment and how. The DSM.
No,
yeah.
we're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time? Okay. Bummer. Thank you for the reminder, Leilani. I appreciate you adulting for me. Okay, everybody, we will pick up this conversation on Wednesday, not Tuesday. Monday we have off. Thank you, MLK. And then Wednesday, we'll begin this conversation again. So bye-bye, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.